Hi, everyone. It's David Ault, and welcome to the gathering. I want to start with this lesson with something that I typically say in any kind of live event or one on one, and that is to be mindful as you're listening and to keep what works for you and to discard the rest. But what makes that invitation interesting is to notice also what it is that you want to discard, because it could be in that information something that is trying to get your attention. It could be something that is wanting to work with you in order to move out of a state of familiarity, perhaps to go deeper, perhaps to turn to something that's uncomfortable. So just weigh those options as you listen today. So I was speaking with a young person who's in college, and probably like all of us during that time frame, we had multiple jobs. And this is a big-hearted person. They love puppies, they love babies, just a beautiful soul. And they are in a job of working for a daycare center. And I'm sure you can understand this scenario. The ratio of them working to the number of babies that they are responsible for is not good. Way too many babies and way too many hours in the shift in order to really give the care that is required for them in all these various developmental stages. And so things happen, and something happened, and the management came down hard on them, screaming and yelling and not being sensitive and not listening to their request. And that prompted something that I bet that you can identify with. And it is this sense of over responsibilitizing. It's this thread that says, I'm the only one who can do this. Have you ever had that feeling? I know that I've had that feeling. And admittedly, that feeling comes from a part of what we call the ego. Simplified, the ego is anything that prompts an idea of separation, an us and them. It doesn't have to necessarily be warring. It doesn't have to be such divisional stuff that is overbearing and toxic. It could be a mindset that simply believes that I'm the only one who can do this. That too is separation, because it's feeding a narrative that somehow we're indispensable, that somehow we are special. And that type of belief system is interesting with regards to the origin. And it's a little hard sometimes to consume. So why are we talking about this? I'm fascinated with what our motivation is. Is most of our motivation from pain, or is most of our motivation from joy? I would venture to guess that it's a little bit of both. But it's interesting to sit down and to look at what motivates you and to begin to write those things down. And could you see that the origin of motivation sometimes is from the ego? It's from a fear. It's from anything that is operative in terms of trying to defend or preserve. That to me is stemming from a pain point rather than joy. And so I look at my life, I look at work history, I look at being in all different types of leadership. And I very much identified with this young person because there were great stretches of my work, admittedly, where I was unconsciously carrying around the idea that I'm the only one who can do this, or I'm responsible, over responsibilitizing. And I'm sure you heard and have seen situations where they say, if you were to retire or if you were to leave this particular position, there would be a replacement in 3 hours. Feels a little harsh, but come on. Isn't that true? When we start to see the way in which the mind works and the allegiance to separation, we start to see that most of our motivation is built from an illusion if it has anything to do with the ego, if it is motivated from pain. And how do we begin to look into sense about around these things? It can be in all different forms. One of the pieces of work that I like to do, I call it revisioning. And it's about taking a moment in time and going back to that moment and sort of playing with the idea of revisioning our reaction. I'll give you an example. So, one time I was working with a large group of spiritual leaders, and we were talking about revisioning. I started the topic with the idea that the phrase "what's done is done" is not a reality. There is no truth to that, because that's to say that time is linear. And if we get all quantum, we can say that time isn't linear, it's unilateral. So the very thing, an event that we regret, or an event that prompted some painful belief or over responsibilitizing, is still very much in operation by the way in which we behave and interact today. And so in the evening of this multi-day event, I gave them the assignment to think about something that they have a regret about, to think about something, a memory that perhaps was painful or they wish that they could change, to not overanalyze it, to go with the very first one that comes into consciousness, and to start with these steps of revisioning, to look at it, to actually be grateful for it, as absurd as that might sound, because whatever our response was to it at the time is still a part of the tactics that moved us through life and got us to where we are today. So we have to somehow be grateful for that rather than to still be in a ratio of regret over it. Can you look at it and be thankful? That's important. And then it's to go back and to notice all of the cast of characters that are in that memory. To consider that we can't change the free will of another person. So you can't go to this memory and say, and change that they didn't abandon you, or they didn't die, or they didn't do this particular act of betrayal, or you can't place the change or the revisioning onto another person. We can only take responsibility for ourselves. And then to bring that memory up and to play, to entertain with the idea how we could be less reactive and more responsive. And of course, there's wide-ranging memories that have elements of trauma that are obviously from time periods of our adolescence when we didn't have the ability to do those things. And so it's nuanced work that has a lot of different entry points to it. But the example that I want to give you is they all went to bed that night, and the next morning we began to talk about it in Q&A. And I asked anyone if they had a memory that they wanted to share. And so this one woman raised her hand and she said, I had a young mother. My sister and I were born to her when she was still a teenager and in her early 20s. So by the time that we were 7 and 8, respectively, our mother was still young. She was single, and she wanted to do what any single woman probably would want to do at that time. She wanted to go out. She wanted to be with people. And so she would put them to bed, and their bedroom, and she was saying that her bed had a direct point of view of the driveway. She could see the street lamp. She could have the sensory of the little pajamas that she was wearing, and she could see her mother back out of the driveway. So if she put them to bed at, say, 10, she couldn't sleep. Something within her over-responsibilized the safety of her mother, the welfare of the family, and she would kind of sit there like a sentinel guarding and waiting until her mother came home. And this was a regular act. And so she said, from a very young age, I would sit there, and sometimes she wouldn't come home until 1, 2 in the morning. And in those hours, I was sitting there as if I was guarding everything. And I said, wow, interesting. I said, what did you do in your revisioning work? What were the beginning steps? And she said, I noticed all of it. I watched my mother back out. And she said, and my revisioning was this: I just laid down and went to sleep. And everyone sort of giggled and laughed, but there was a lot of familiarity and identification with what she was saying. And I said, can you tell me a little bit about how that one action influences and colors your behavior in present time? And she said, of course. She goes, I'm someone who has to control everything. She goes, I know that I'm doing it, and yet it feels as though I can't stop. And I know that it causes problems. It causes problems in staffing. It causes problems in the way in which I lead a staff. It causes problems in all kinds of ways because people want to contribute, but I'm always sort of overbearingly watching and correcting. And I was like, wow, that is a perfect example of a genesis or a beginning of where such a topic or a belief might start. And so I want to ask you today, is there an element within you, much like the young person that I was speaking about, that has this idea that I'm the only one that can do this? Because I will tell you that that influences your motivation and the way in which you start things. And so what's the other option? So the other option is my motivation and my desire to do things in the world stems from joy. It's as if I have gone through the experience of this other, this separateness, this egoic impulse, and I have learned my lesson. So I will say that I've learned my lesson. I noticed that kind of behavior. And I began to kind of play around with that and give others responsibility. As a spiritual leader, I became very, very open and playful with the idea of letting other voices be in front. There were great swaths of the calendar during the year where I'd say, let's give this to young people. Let's do this to this particular spiritual lineage, and began to understand that everybody learns differently. And so there was less control about it had to be me and more joyfulness and openness with let's see what people resonate to. That's one example. But you can imagine if you're in a corporate environment or you're even parenting, that a lot of times what begins to develop is this heavy-handedness and this over-responsibilitizing. So if you want to be more mindful about your motivation and allowing it to come from joy, then I believe that the first step is to revision a little bit about what's painful and to go, I wonder where this idea of being irreplaceable comes from. Because if we're all the same, if we're all one, then as much as we might love the romanticism of being irreplaceable, we're not. Time marches on. And everything that we do, imagine if we can do what we do from a place of love and not trying to cultivate an audience, not trying to gather some type of power. Gosh, so much of marketing these days and the way in which I see colleagues and people doing this, they're trying to get something. They're trying to get a particular piece of influence and power in this market. And no one's faulting anybody, but I find that when somebody is doing it simply because they love it, not because they're trying to increase an audience, not because they're trying to get anything. They're just offering the gift. And they trust that it will land wherever it lands. That it feels different. The message feels different. And I believe that all of us have that within us to do our thing, to give our creativity from that pure place where there's no investment in creating it as a vehicle for power. Because there can even be spiritual power just as much as there's power of greed. But to do it from here's a little bit of my offering. I shared this bit of wisdom with you. Again, take it, keep it what works for you, and discard the rest. So I find that the thing that helps the motivation come from joy is to begin to let go of the things that feel like they're obligation. One of my favorite words, again, is alacrity. Alacrity simply means to show up and to do things from enthusiasm, to approach something with zeal. And I find that that eliminates a lot of my suffering if I adhere to that. If I make saying yes to something from that place of enthusiasm rather than obligation, because I tell you, obligation comes from the idea that I'm the only one who can do this. How do you feel about that? What would it be like to begin to evaluate your decisions and to say, I want to do this because it brings me joy, not because I feel obligated, not because some marketing company is telling me that this is how I will get more likes, not because I'm trying to be an influencer. I'm teaching, I'm sharing my gift, I'm taking care of babies, I'm walking these dogs. I am a CPA because I love numbers and I love helping people do things that they don't like to do. I am a painter, a sculptor, a singer because I'm sharing my gift from the pure place that must create, not because I'm trying to market all the time. And I'm not saying or defacing or doing anything against marketing. But beware the line crossing that comes when I'm starting to look at others as competition rather than camaraderie. It's a beautiful thing, right? To do what we love and to understand what fulfillment feels like. What does fulfillment feel like? I wrote down this morning, get to know what fulfillment feels like because it's different than relief. Get to know what fulfillment feels like because it's different than relief, because relief is a product of control. And anytime we go in relief, it's because preceding that has been this activity of thinking that we're controlling something, of thinking that perhaps we're irreplaceable, of thinking that perhaps we're the only ones that can figure this out. But fulfillment is this relaxation that comes in knowing that we are freely giving, that we are in sort of a reciprocal flow that isn't limited to identification, meaning that I give, and if I give to XYZ, I'm not holding XYZ responsible for giving back to me. I'm just giving because I realize that reciprocal flow is much more grand and much more infinite than I can even be aware of. And so I give not to get. I teach not to recruit. I parent not to control. I lead not to invoke some false sense of power. But now I'm just in this interaction realizing that I'm no better and no less than anyone. I'm just utilizing this vehicle, this human form, at this juncture of incarnation to share in the reciprocal flow of love, basically. Therefore, then, my operation in life is not this resignation that everything is associated with pain or over responsibilitizing, but that each thing that I show up in, I get to stop and I get to say, what is my motivation? Am I operating from alacrity? And it takes practice, I will say. See, I don't really know that I could speak to you with any authenticity about this if I didn't have a history of being motivated by pain. Do you see? That's why in any kind of teaching, it's sort of like you have to go into the cave of the things that are uncomfortable in order to be able to look at them and to see what is my moment in time that locked into this, so that there can be an availability to what's beyond. Do you see what I mean? In the journey of this, sometimes it's important to walk through, as the old joke says, to walk through the valley of the shadow of death, but not to stay and build a condo there. In other words, don't become seduced in the identification of you as the bearer of this pain. Look at it and go, what is mine to learn from this? And begin to become more and more fluid with the way in which the journey then continues, so that we can all share that wisdom, the wisdom of the journey, so that we can all speak from authenticity and not some kind of manufactured pablum, but we can begin to see that not everything is as it seems, that there are so many different factors and multidimensional opportunities in order to understand. I can begin to see that so much of my motivation from pain, perhaps it's much bigger than just me, David, that it's a lineage of something that my soul is working on. And I don't have to hold anyone else responsible or hostage for fixing it. And then, that authenticity can begin to grow and to percolate. So going back to the very beginning, keep what works for you. Discard the rest. And be mindful. Be mindful of the thing that you want to discard, because it could be a nugget of an egoic thing that tells us that somehow no one understands, or we are the only ones who could, ... Begin to look at that. Begin to consider that that's not true. It's only true because we keep revisiting it. It's only true because we have stopped and built residency in our identification, and that it is possible to let our motivations come from joy. Thank you. Be well. Reach out. It's what this is here for. It's for us as beings to go about our various ways of seeking, and to not make any other path wrong, but to just be calm and to still and in our own work, and to always return to the love. Always return to a loving observation. Always return to our own kind of work with revisioning, but to do it with great compassion. Compassion for self, compassion for others, because we're all in this together. So it is. Till next time.